Hello, I'm Nancy Boone, Federal Preservation Officer at HUD in the Office of Environment and Energy. Welcome to this webcast on using the historic tax credit for affordable housing. We are broadcasting live today from HUD headquarters in Washington, D.C., and we'll be taking questions at the end of the presentation. Over 800 people are participating in this webcast. We're very thrilled about that, and we will answer as many questions as we can today, with the caveat that we cannot offer tax advice on individual situations. To submit your questions, please send an email to oeewebcast@hud.gov at any time during the webcast. We will also be posting extensive related material on HUD's website in the coming weeks, including links to all the references mentioned today and an archived version of this webcast. The content presented in this webinar represents the views and experience of guest presenter Elizabeth Rosen and do not necessarily represent the official policy or position of HUD or the National Park Service. Our presenter today is Elizabeth Rosen, principal at Rosen Preservation. Elizabeth has a master's degree in historic preservation and has worked in the field for over 25 years. She is based in Kansas City, but works across the country, and that work has included consulting on over 100 successful historic tax credit projects, representing an investment of over $1 billion in rehabilitated historic buildings. For the question and answer session, we will also be joined by Brian Gokin, Chief of Technical Preservation Services at the National Park Service, where he oversees the Historic Tax Credit Program. HUD gratefully acknowledges the Park Service's assistance on this webcast. And I also want to thank the National Trust for Historic Preservation, who helped us with some of the graphics that you'll see. We hope that you will be inspired by today's presentation to consider developing historic buildings in your community for affordable housing. And to tell us how the historic tax credit may help those efforts, here's Elizabeth.
Thanks, Nancy. Let's get started. The 20% federal historic tax credit is a financial incentive that encourages investment in historic buildings, some of which have outlived their original purpose. It encourages private property owners to rehabilitate historic properties for an income-producing use, such as rental housing, office, retail, manufacturing, and entertainment. All of these properties have used the historic tax credit. It is an important tool for the redevelopment of historic main streets and can be a catalyst for neighborhood and downtown revitalization. It can also be an effective tool to create affordable housing, including mixed-use affordable developments, such as this building that has commercial tenants on the first floor and apartments on the upper floor. More and more affordable developers across the country are using the historic tax credit because it creates more opportunities for affordable housing by making it financially viable to rehabilitate properties in historic districts, adapt and reuse vacant schools, and bring new life to neighborhood eyesores. Two additional benefits of historic rehab are existing infrastructure and the inherent sustainability of reusing existing structures. Rehabbing historic properties in higher cost markets means designating affordable units in areas with better access to services and opportunities. In lower cost markets, historic rehab preserves cultural and community heritage, helping to create a sense of place and building momentum for equitable neighborhood development. Doing historic rehab can even increase equity for a LIHTC project. In all cases, the historic tax credit helps to make affordable and historic developments economically viable. Even public housing authorities are using the historic tax credit. Through HUD's RAD program, public housing authorities may partner with private investors interested in the historic credit to rehabilitate historic public housing developments, such as the Iberville complex in New Orleans, where it was used to upgrade historic units to modern standards, without losing the character of the historic place. The historic tax credit rewards owners for making an investment that extends the economic life of older buildings, and it becomes a source of project equity when syndicated to outside investors. The historic tax credit represents 20% of qualified expenses. I'll discuss these more in a moment. It directly reduces income taxes owed. Each dollar of tax credit offsets $1 of taxes due, so that a project with $1 million of qualified expenses, or QRE, will generate $200,000 of historic tax credits to offset $200,000 of federal income taxes. All of these buildings were rehabbed using both the historic tax credit and the low-income housing tax credit, or LIHTC. The historic credit is used in small towns and rural communities, as well as urban centers. The properties that use the historic credit represent the full spectrum of building functions, architectural styles, and periods of construction. Investment in the historic tax credit projects can be catalytic for community revitalization. Many communities have a historic white elephant building that would qualify for the program. Vacant school buildings, for instance, are frequently converted to affordable housing. The 1918 high school in Baxter Springs, Kansas, became 28 senior apartments using the historic tax credit and LIHTC. The project restored several key historic building elements, including the monumental cornice and period-appropriate windows. While large, high-dollar rehab projects attract a lot of attention, buildings of all sizes can take advantage of the historic credit. Over just the past 5 years, roughly 50% of all historic tax credit projects had qualified expenses less than $1 million, and roughly 25% of these projects had qualified expenses less than $250,000. Since the program started in 1976, historic tax credits have impacted communities throughout the country. The statistics for the program are truly impressive when you look at the number of buildings preserved, the investment made, and jobs created. Most significantly for this conversation, over 150,000 units of new and rehabbed affordable housing units were created. This map, produced by the National Trust for Historic Preservation, shows the distribution of historic tax credit projects across the United States since 2002. You can see that over just the last 15 years, historic tax credit projects have been completed in every state in the country. So is there a white elephant property in your community? Can you think of a historic property that you could develop? Keep that site in mind while we look at what is required to participate in the program. Unlike LIHTC, historic tax credits are available through a non-competitive open application process. That means if you meet the program requirements, you get the tax credit. The project must involve an income-producing, certified historic structure. The scope of work must meet the requirements of a certified historic rehab and must make a substantial investment in the property, specifically in items that are considered qualified rehab expenditures, or QRE. That's a lot of words to simply say that if your project has $5 million of qualified expenses, you will receive a historic tax credit valued at $1 million. There is no cap on the amount of credits an individual project can claim, nor on the amount of credits available for the program in any given fiscal year. Let's break down these terms. So the property has to be income producing for 5 years after the tax credit project is completed. In terms of housing, that means it must remain rental housing for the entire duration of this period. The building must be listed in the National Register of Historic Places to qualify for the credit. We'll come back to this topic in more detail in a minute, but briefly, certified buildings can be listed either individually or as contributing to a historic district. Some buildings in a historic district can be non-contributing because of age or alterations. To find out if a building in a historic district is contributing, refer to the map in the National Register nomination. The nomination map for this historic district in Warrensburg, Missouri, shows all of the contributing resources shaded white. These buildings, like those in the photo, are all eligible to use the historic tax credit. The rehab project must meet the Secretary of the Interior's standards for rehabilitation to be considered a certified historic rehab. When you submit your application, the State Historic Preservation Office, or SHPO, and the National Park Service, the NPS, review photographs of the building, architectural plans, and a written scope of work to ensure that the project preserves the character-defining features of the historic building, the site, and its environment. In this example, significant masonry repairs were made and historically appropriate new windows and storefronts were installed, while on the interior, the historically significant features of the office corridor were incorporated into the affordable housing conversion. Let's stop and look at that one again. This is so impressive. The before and the after. And this project used both historic tax credits and LIHTC. Just like LIHTC, some expenses qualify for the credit and some do not. QRE includes depreciable construction costs as well as allocated soft costs. This includes permanent treatments to the exterior and the interior of the building. A simple way to visualize this is to imagine turning the building upside down. Anything that falls out is not QRE. This is a general list of items that are non-qualified expenses. All other costs related to your development should be QRE. The IRS requires that you spend a minimum of $5,000 or the adjusted basis of the building. The formula is somewhat complicated, but essentially it's calculated to be the purchase price less the value of the land. In other words, you need to invest the value of the building in your rehab project. If you have previously made improvements to the building, those costs need to be added to the equation, and any earned depreciation can be subtracted. Your project must meet the substantial investment test in a 24-month period. The applicant has some flexibility in defining that window, but if needed, the project can be phased to extend the 24-month window to 60 months. The online guidance will include more information about phasing. So let's talk a little more about the National Register and the Secretary Standards. The National Register of Historic Places is the nation's list of historic properties that merit preservation. The National Register is administered by the National Park Service with input from the state preservation offices. Typically, resources must be at least 50 years old to qualify for National Register designation, which now includes properties built through 1967. There are also exceptions for newer resources that can demonstrate exceptional significance. You can find out if a building is on the National Register by visiting the National Register website or contacting your SHPO. To list a building on the National Register, it must demonstrate significance in one of 4 areas, shown here as criteria A through D. Significance can be at the local, state, or national level. The resource must also retain enough of its historic, character-defining elements to communicate that significance. This is called integrity. The listing process usually takes 6 to 9 months to complete and is separate from historic tax credit review. Rehabilitation can begin before a building has NR status, but the building must be officially listed within 30 months after rehabilitation is complete. You can claim tax credits while the nomination is in progress at your own risk. The 4 buildings you see on this slide were built between 1840 and 1973. All are listed on the National Register, and all were certified rehab projects that now provide affordable housing. The Secretary's standards for rehabilitation preserve a building's historic character while allowing for modifications that adapt it for a new function and allow it to remain economically viable. When Mount Washington School was converted into affordable apartments for seniors, great care was taken to replace non-historic windows to match those shown on historic plans and photos. The standards do not require that missing historic features be recreated, although developers often do restore important missing elements to enhance a building's character. The large open volume of 2 signature spaces inside the school, the auditorium and the library, was maintained and the historic trim was restored. Removal of non-historic elements, like the dropped ceiling in the library, helped to recapture the building's historic ambiance. There are 10 standards, and a historic tax credit project must meet all 10. The 10 standards for rehabilitation can be summarized as: retain and repair historic materials, features, and spaces, retain historic character even if use changes, and design alterations and additions so they are both compatible and reversible. Let's look at a few examples. When the Bancroft School was converted into affordable apartments, the project team worked hard to retain the building's character-defining elements. They installed new windows to match the original windows. Plaster walls and ceilings were repaired throughout the building, and the auditorium was preserved for community meetings. Distinctive elements in the corridors like trim, classroom doors, and transoms were repaired. And the transoms are those elements, the windows over the doorway. New walls were added within the large classrooms to create apartments, while trim elements like chalkboard frames continued to communicate the building's original function. Harmful materials like lead paint and asbestos were removed without removing the historic materials. This is a great before and after, so let's look at it one more time. There's your before and your after. It's important to keep as much historic fabric as possible. You have to be able to justify removing any character-defining features. Windows, as you've probably gathered, are always a big concern. When the Murray Hill School was converted to affordable senior housing, the unique window system could not be altered, but the project team successfully incorporated it into the new design. Elm Terrace, formerly a children's hospital, was converted into 38 affordable units. The project included construction of a new addition that was discreetly tucked behind the original building and used compatible materials to match the original facade. On the left, you see the addition set behind the historic building, and on the right is the discrete connector that links the new and old buildings. While the cost of building the addition and connector was not QRE, the additional space was needed to give the project a viable unit count. The sensitive design met the Secretary's standards and was approved as part of the rehab. Because each building is unique in its architecture, history, current conditions, and context for redevelopment, reviewers consider the individual building history and circumstances to help determine the appropriateness of a proposed rehab. What may be appropriate for one project may not be appropriate for another. Rehab of the Hollywood Bungalow Courts provides housing for special needs and low-income residents. The project preserved unique historic features, including an array of original built-in elements inside the apartments, as well as the open space, landscaping, and scale of development that are as essential to the property's historic character as the buildings themselves. One community benefit of the historic credit is that the projects preserve the diversity of housing stock that creates community character. The standards give a developer a lot to think about. Fortunately, the National Park Service website features an array of technical guidance, starting with the guidelines for rehabilitation, which provide general advice and do's and don'ts to help you meet the Secretary's standards. There are also preservation briefs and technical case studies that discuss how specific building elements and rehabilitation treatments may be reviewed. These can inspire solutions to a number of common rehab issues, such as windows, large open rooms, abatement, and even sustainability. Yes, that's right. You can be historic, sustainable, and affordable. What I really want you to take away from this slide is that there is no need to reinvent the wheel when you're working on a rehab project. It's all been done before. If you encounter an issue, it's likely someone else already encountered it and identified a solution. In addition to the online guidance from NPS, your SHPO staff are a great resource for finding appropriate solutions. Often they can make a visit to the site to help understand the situation and help you explore options. So let's dig into the guidance on a couple of common topics. I've mentioned windows several times already, and as you probably guessed, windows are often a complex and expensive item on a historic project. But don't let this dissuade you from taking on a rehab. The NPS website provides detailed instructions on how to evaluate windows for repair or replacement. You should always consider repair first, as the costs for repair and energy upgrades are often comparable to replacement. Here, the original wood windows at the Chatham Apartments were unable to be repaired as they were in extremely poor condition. NPS approved new aluminum windows that matched the configuration, dimensions, and profiles of the original wood windows, but with insulated glazing for greater energy efficiency. If you're going to replace windows, it is critical to have your shop drawings approved before moving forward. I know of one developer who installed windows without this approval and then had to replace all the windows again to claim their tax credits. Please don't learn this lesson the hard way. Always get your windows approved up front. Auditoriums, church sanctuaries, and other large interior rooms often raise questions about how they will be incorporated into a rehab project. These spaces are often critical to defining a building's historic character and function, and subdividing them will compromise the historic character. At Seven Oaks School, much of the auditorium was restored as community meeting space, while a wall was added behind the proscenium to incorporate the backstage area into a new apartment unit. NPS offers online guidance that shows how other projects have successfully adapted these spaces for new building uses. The abatement of lead or other hazardous materials is vital to protect residents, but must be done with sensitivity to character-defining materials. Again, NPS and HUD offer lots of guidance on this topic to meet both the historic standards and other housing and environmental regulations. A rehabbed building is inherently more sustainable than new construction, and historic tax credit projects frequently achieve LEED status, or recognition by other programs that encourage environmental sustainability. As interest in sustainability has increased, NPS has produced numerous publications on the topic as it relates to historic projects. For instance, it is increasingly common to find solar arrays tucked out of sight on the roofs of historic buildings to help offset electric usage. So we've talked about the basic criteria and the specific requirements of the historic tax credit. Now let's look at the application process. To do this, we are going to follow a single project through from start to finish. This case study will look at the Coliseum Apartments in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So before we get started with the Coliseum, I want to give you a quick overview. There are 3 parts to the historic tax credit application. All 3 are reviewed first by SHPO and next by NPS. And there are 3 entry points to the application, depending on your building's National Register status. If your property is not on the register, you would start by preparing a draft nomination and filing this with your Part 1 application. This is the blue box on the upper left. If your property is already contributing to a district, you file the Part 1 to confirm that status, or the gold box on the middle side on the left. If your property is individually listed, you can go directly to the Part 2, shown in the brown box on the right. The process for Part 2 and Part 3 is the same for all projects. In some variations of the scenario, work can begin or credits can be claimed prior to NPS approvals, but always at the owner's risk. Now, don't worry about memorizing this chart. It will definitely be available in our online guidance after the webcast. So let's start with Part 1. This is the Coliseum apartment building. It was built in 1929 to provide workforce housing in downtown Tulsa during the oil boom. It is not individually listed, but it is in the Blue Dome Historic District. So we checked the National Register nomination to see if it is a contributing resource. Both the text of the nomination and the map indicate that the building is contributing. So we will prepare the Part 1 application to document this. The Part 1 application requests information about the building's physical appearance, architectural integrity, history, and significance. For buildings that are not already on the NR, this information enables the reviewers to determine if it is eligible. For properties like the Coliseum Apartments that are in a historic district, this information confirms that the building still has the qualities that made it contributing when the NR was designated. Part 1 approval for buildings that are not yet on the NR provides developers, investors, and lenders with a level of comfort before the project moves forward. After the Part 1 is approved, these owners can start the National Register review process. As you saw in the flow chart, this is a separate process from the historic tax credit review and takes about 6 to 9 months to complete. Photos documenting existing conditions are also critical to the Part 1 application. This photo map for the Coliseum Apartments shows the photo views for exterior and first floor images that we submitted with the application. There are similar photo keys for the second floor and third floor too. Before photos show existing conditions, on the exterior and interior, as well as the configuration and relationship of spaces, the types and conditions of building materials, and the character-defining features and finishes that communicate the historic style, function, and significance of the property. Significant elements at the Coliseum Apartments include the exterior brickwork and terracotta ornament, the shaped roofline on the street-facing facades, the windows, and the decorative treatment at the entrance. On the interior, we see the arrangement of small apartments flanking a double-loaded corridor, and plaster walls and ceilings with minimal trim. Sometimes you also need a little imagination to envision what these buildings can become. Part 2 is the heart of the application. It includes a detailed description of the proposed rehab, including materials and techniques, and it presents architectural plans and pertinent construction specifications. This slide shows items from the Coliseum Part 2, laying out existing conditions and proposed treatments. Many investors and lenders require an approved Part 2 application before they will close on project financing. The plans that you submit with the Part 2 don't have to be 100% complete, but they must have enough information to show the reviewers how the historic features will be treated and how new elements will be added. Additional detailed photos documenting existing conditions are submitted with the Part 2 if they weren't submitted with the Part 1. If SHPO or NPS feels that an element of the scope does not meet the standards, they will place a condition on the approval. As long as the completed rehab addresses the condition, the Part 3 application will be approved at the end of the project. The reviewers prefer to issue a clean approval with few, if any, conditions, and will help the applicants figure out how to revise the scope of work to meet the standards. Construction can start before NPS approves the Part 2 application, but again, at increased risk. If at the end of construction, one element of the scope does not meet standards, you may not be able to claim the credits. You can't partially comply or pick which elements you want credits for. You either qualify for the credits or you don't. Applicants can file an amendment to officially revise the scope of work to address conditions. Approval of the amendment assures the applicant that NPS will approve the revised approach when the Part 3 is submitted. An amendment can also be filed if new information becomes available or if the scope of work evolves during construction. And this happens more often than not. A survey of windows at the Coliseum Apartments determined that they were beyond repair, so we submitted an amendment to get approval for replacement windows. The application described the purpose of the amendment and included comparative shop drawings for the windows. When construction is complete, you'll photo document the building to show reviewers that the rehab was completed as approved. Each of these after images is keyed to a photo map, just like the before photos. At the Coliseum Apartments, you can see the masonry has been repointed and cleaned, the windows were replaced, the historic configuration of spaces was maintained, and the finishes restored. The apartments are simple as originally designed, but with modern kitchens and bathrooms. Now that your rehab is complete, it is time to file the Part 3 application. Part 3 certifies that the completed rehab meets the Secretary standards. The submittal includes the after photos, estimated QRE and total project costs, and ownership information for the assignment of credits. If a project is phased, you can file an amendment for NPS to review and certify that the completed phase of the rehab meets the standards. The approved amendment can be used as evidence of pending approval and may allow the applicant to start claiming federal credits. NPS charges a fee to review the Part 2 and Part 3 applications, and this fee has a sliding scale based on project cost. The applicant will pay half of the fee when NPS receives the Part 2 application and half when they receive the Part 3 application. So when your project is complete and your Part 3 is approved, you are ready to claim the credits. As we discussed earlier, you can use the historic tax credit to offset income tax liability dollar for dollar. This begins the year the building is placed in service. The credit can also be carried back 1 year and forward up to 20 years. Claiming the credit is very straightforward. The taxpayer submits IRS Form 3468 along with the NPS project number with your annual tax documents. If your project has not yet received Part 3 approval, you must complete that step within 30 months after the placed in service date. The amount of the credit calculated on Form 3468 is deducted from the bottom line of taxes owed. As I mentioned earlier, if a project has multiple phases, partial credit can be claimed when one or more phases are placed into service and the substantial investment test is met. The partial credit drawdown will be subject to recapture if the project does not ultimately receive Part 3 certification. Historic tax credits are also subject to recapture if building ownership changes or non-compliant alterations are made within 5 years after NPS approves the Part 3. Recapture will be prorated based on the amount of time passed since the Part 3 approval. The historic tax credit can only be claimed by the owner of the property, but that ownership structure can take multiple forms. A fee simple property owner could be an individual, a partnership, or a corporation. The only requirement for this program is that the owner be for profit. A limited partnership can distribute the benefit to its members. In this scenario, an equity partner can invest in the project in exchange for rights to the credit. That investment then helps finance the rehab. Historic projects typically attract a net investment of around 70 cents per dollar of credit that will be claimed. New IRS safe harbor rules issued in 2015 required that the investor be a real partner with potential for both gains and losses in the deal. Under some circumstances, a long-term lessee can claim the historic tax credit. But because every situation is unique, always check with a tax advisor before starting a project to understand how the historic tax credit will apply to your particular circumstances. Many developers combine the historic tax credit with other local, state, and federal incentives. State historic tax credits are currently available in 35 states, and nearly half of all federal historic projects are twinned with this incentive. Many state credits can be directly transferred, that's sold, to other businesses or individuals who want to offset their state tax obligation. If your project is in a state that has a state historic credit, check with your real estate attorney or tax advisor to see if these are transferable and by what means. In just the last few weeks while we were putting this presentation together, Alabama reinstated their state tax credit. That is great news for developers working in that state. This graphic shows the impact of a strong state historic tax credit. The states in dark green, Missouri and Virginia, have very user-friendly state tax credit programs. And because of this, they regularly submit a high volume of historic tax credit applications. The states in bright green also have strong state historic programs that encourage the use of the federal credit. The two most common federal incentives used with the historic credit are LIHTC, the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit, and New Markets Tax Credits. Other incentives that developers often combine with federal historic credits are HUD programs like HOME and CDBG, USDA rural loan programs, brownfields grants, tax abatement, and tax increment financing. Investment in a historic tax credit project can also count toward CRA requirements for banks. Be aware, though, that a federal grant may affect the amount of historic credits a project receives. If your project is using additional sources of federal funds, again, be sure to consult with your tax advisor to understand how these funds may affect your project's overall financial picture. As I noted earlier, historic tax credit projects have rehabilitated over 150,000 units of affordable housing since 1976. Some of these projects, like Neighborhood Gardens in St. Louis, shown here, were originally developed as public housing, while others adaptively reuse buildings constructed for other purposes. Affordable housing developers like to combine the historic credit with LIHTC because it attracts additional equity to a project. While the program guidelines are generally compatible, be aware that the programs differ in some fairly significant ways, like how the credits are calculated, which costs are QRE, and when the credits are awarded. The historic credit will reduce the eligible basis for the LIHTC, although LIHTC does not affect the amount of historic credits a project earns. We have covered a lot of ground in the last hour, and as we wrap up this presentation, I would like to leave you with 5 secrets for a successful historic tax credit project. First, assemble a team of experienced, knowledgeable professionals to make your project run smoothly. These might include a preservation consultant who understands the application process, procedures, and standards, an architect and structural and MEP engineers who are experienced with historic buildings, and a real estate attorney and tax accountant who are familiar with the tax rules related to the historic credit. Second, initiate contact with SHPO staff early in the development process and maintain regular communication from beginning to end. Third, allow ample time for the review process. And this is one I can't emphasize enough. At minimum, the review period for each part of your application is 60 days, although it isn't unusual for it to run 90 days, particularly at peak periods in the construction cycle. While these timeframes can sound daunting, they usually mesh well with the general development process if you anticipate them from the outset. You will sleep a lot better knowing your Part 2 has been approved before you incur major expenditures and the hammers start swinging. Fourth, it is very common for the rehab scope to evolve during construction. New information becomes available, budgets loosen or tighten, and so forth. If plans change, don't assume that they will meet the standards. Talk with SHPO and submit an amendment for review. Finally, throughout the process, address issues proactively before they become problems. Engage SHPO in addressing these situations, whether they occur before, during, or after construction. Thank you for being part of this webcast. Development of affordable housing in historic buildings preserves our shared heritage while creating strong, sustainable, and inclusive communities and improving the quality of life for residents.
Thank you, Elizabeth. That was great. We would also now like to welcome Brian Gokin to help answer your questions. And I want to remind you that you can send questions in to oeewebcast@hud.gov, and we will try to get as many questions as we can answered today online. So please send in your questions, and we're going to have those directed to the presenters here, and we'll try to do our best in getting you an answer. The first question that I'm seeing coming up is, do the Secretary's standards require that you put back features that are missing?
Well, first, Nancy, thank you. I want to thank HUD for producing this webcast today on the program, and Elizabeth for that fine overview of the Historic Tax Credit Program. It's a really important program with a unique dual mission, promotes economic development and preserving the nation's historic buildings and heritage. I also want to thank the State Historic Preservation Offices that are our partners in administering this program and the Internal Revenue Service that administers the tax code part of the program. So back to that question, do the Secretary's Interior standards require you to put back missing items? And the answer is generally no. We only review the work that you're actually proposing to do, the scope of work that you're including in your application. We do review all the work that's proposed, so it includes the work, as Elizabeth said, whether it's QRE related or not. There are a few instances where you may be required to do work that you were not proposing, and it would be in the instances, again, a very few instances where there is something about the building, usually about the condition of it, that you need to do something so it doesn't further deteriorate. So it could be masonry work or flashing or roof-related work that without doing it, it would cause the building to deteriorate, and that would be contrary to the Secretary's standards.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Brian. So another question came in email. As a president of a 501c3, and do we have a historical two-family ready to use as a pilot? How long can the credits be used for investors' benefit? Elizabeth, you want to handle that one?
Sure, and I think this is one of the differences between LIHTC and historic credits. The historic credits become available when the building is placed in service, and they can be, you can amend your previous year tax returns to apply them back 1 year or carry them forward 20 years. You would want to talk with your tax advisor, though, to find out if it's possible to segment the credits and extend them over a period of time.
Great, thank you. So we have mentioned LIHTC several times during the presentation, quite a few times, and someone has written in, what does LIHTC stand for again, and is it a HUD program? So LIHTC is the Low Income Housing Tax Credit Program, and it is not a HUD program. It is administered by the Department of the Treasury. That's a common misunderstanding. So let's see. Here's an interesting one. Isn't there a 10% federal credit for rehabilitation of old buildings?
And there is a 10% credit. The 10% credit, though, is only available for non-historic buildings that were placed in service prior to 1936. And it's only available for non-residential uses. So in the context of our webinar today, it wouldn't be applicable.
Right. Thank you. Here's one related to sustainability. Are solar panels permanently installed on a roof a qualified rehabilitation expenditure?
I believe so. It would be like any other mechanical system.
Okay.
Oop.
One is just being posted, I think. If a building rehabilitation is approved for a historic tax credit, does it still need to go through Section 106? Yes, it does. They're separate processes, but in general, you can assume that if your project is meeting the historic tax credit standards, the Secretary of Interior standards for rehabilitation, the work on the building is also going to meet the requirements for Section 106, which also uses the Secretary's standards. Sometimes there are elements of a project that are outside the review of the historic tax credit program, like archaeological resources that might be affected on a site, and those would still have to go through a thorough review under Section 106, along with consultation with other interested parties.
Can I add to that, Nancy?
Yes.
It's been our experience that if a project is applying for historic tax credits and going through Section 106, you don't have to provide duplicate sets of information, but when you submit your Part 2 application, Section 106 staff at SHPO will use that, look at that as they complete their Section 106 review. You do have to let them know and file the official project information form for Section 106, but you don't have to provide duplicate sets of information.
It's the SHPO who is reviewing things under Section 106 and under the tax credit program in general, although sometimes different parts of the same office.
Yeah.
Did you want to add anything to that, Brian? No. So here's one. We're an Indian tribe with a National Historic Landmark on trust land. As a tribe, we do pay income tax. Thus, the question of how an investor might benefit and be attracted to investing in the rehabilitation of our trust asset. This is a tough one. Brian?
So the answer is that it depends. And it is something you will have to talk with your tax attorney or advisor about. Tribal with trust land and other issues related to the tribes, as you indicated, it does depend on the ownership, whether it's taxable, is it in a commercial use, and is it going to meet the other requirements for it to be eligible for the historic tax credit. I would say in general, if you're eligible for the low-income housing tax credit for LIHTC, then you should also be eligible for the historic tax credit because you've met the ownership structure required. But I think there's other instances where, because of the use or potentially how the property is held and in terms of the ownership, it may not be eligible for the historic tax credit.
Thank you. Are there particular affordability restrictions built into the historic tax credit program that ensure it produces affordable housing? Elizabeth?
No, because the historic tax credit can be used for affordable housing and it can also be used for market rate housing, all sorts of different uses. So creating affordable housing is just one positive benefit of the program, and it helps provide more equity to those projects.
And if I might add to that, Nancy, we do know from our own statistics of the program that the vast majority of projects are in low and middle income housing tax credits, census tracts, excuse me. Low and middle income housing. Why am I struggling with that? They're in low and mid income census tracts, or they're in, and I believe over 75–80% of all the projects are in economically distressed census tracts or neighborhoods as well.
Yeah, so the full range of income producing uses can be candidates for the historic tax credit program. And today we're focusing on affordable housing, but the program is much broader than that. Another question coming in. Typically, historic buildings will have some degree of hazardous materials. At what point should a building be preserved or replaced? Is there some guidance from funding sources? Who would like that?
Brian.
I guess it's kind of mixing maybe a couple different issues. Elizabeth talked a bit about the hazardous materials issues, and as I think you said in a very smart, brilliant kind of a way of summing that point up, at this point I think there is no new problem probably with rehabilitating these buildings. We have dealt with pretty much every kind of issue at this point. So generally I'd say in terms of the hazardous materials, those are issues that we've always been able to solve. I think probably the larger issue is, as with any project, is we understand that the project has to pencil out, and that's a decision that the individual property owner has to make as to whether they want to avail themselves with this program and the requirements in order to qualify for the HTC.
Yeah, and we have seen projects that have had a substantial amount of abatement, particularly mid-century buildings where there was a lot of asbestos that needed to be removed, particularly in like an office to residential conversion. The question is how, I have never seen a project where abatement was so significant that it completely eliminated all of the historic materials or the qualities that were required for the historic tax credit. So I don't think that there would ever be a case where your abatement would result in the demolition of a building rather than rehabilitation, or unless the condition was so bad.
Here's a question about cost. What kind of pricing can a developer expect for historic tax credits at this time? So a syndication question.
So I actually had a conversation with somebody about this just a couple weeks ago, somebody who is putting a deal together right now and had talked to multiple different investors, and he said that some will provide more money up front with bigger fees and costs down the road, and some will provide less up front with more down the road. He said no matter how he was looking at it, the deals seemed to net out at 70 cents on the dollar. So some investors may offer you more than that up front, but by the time you factor all the other fees and time value in, it's about 70 cents on the dollar.
My building needs an elevator, and the only place we can put it is in a new circulation tower in the back. Is the elevator a qualified rehabilitation expenditure?
No, it is not. It may be necessary to make the project work. We see this quite often, but it is not QRE because it is outside the volume of the historic building.
So I want to go back and show that email address once again. If you'd like to email in questions, we're here to answer them. The email address is oeewebcast@hud.gov. That's oeewebcast@hud.gov. Another question coming in. I have a property with 6 buildings, all historic. Can I group them together in one historic tax credit application? Brian, that sounds like one for you.
Sure. So the answer is it depends. If the buildings are part of what we term a functionally related complex, that is that they operated or existed as a functional relationship historically. Think of, for example, a factory complex or a campus of institutional buildings. They would be treated as one project for the purposes of certification. By our regulations, we do not treat row houses as one project. We treat those as separate projects. If a project involved, let's just say 8 commercial buildings in a row on a street, but they were not functionally related, those would be separate projects. So it depends on the specific circumstances as to how we would treat them.
Thanks, Brian. If a project is turned down, which we hope after watching the webinar today will never happen to you, but if a project is turned down, is there an appeal process?
Sure, I'd be happy to answer that. There is an appeal process. There is a chief appeals officer, and all decisions by the National Park Service are appealable to the chief appeals officer. But let me also emphasize that it's a very, very small number of projects that are denied, and even a smaller number of projects that they go to appeal. And I think that's because the State Historic Preservation Office and our staff at the National Park Service work with the applicants to address, identify, and kind of work through any issues with the projects so that they can avoid getting to the point where they would have to be denied. Probably the biggest reason of why there is potentially a problem with a project is that the work is undertaken without prior review and approval. So we always, as Elizabeth indicated in her presentation, recommend that you get prior review and approval before starting any work. But as I said, the vast majority of projects are approved with conditions. In instances where there are some kinds of issues or problems in the project meeting the Secretary of the Interior standards, we work with the applicant, as does the State Historic Preservation Office, and we're typically able to work through those. And it's a very small, literally just a couple dozen projects that are actually denied in any given year.
Yeah, and I will add to that Brian's staff and your SHPO staff, they are great at working with you so that an application does not get denied. A denial isn't fun for anybody, and it's much easier if we can figure out a way to make the project work and meet the program standards at the same time.
Great. Well, it looks like we have managed to get through all the questions that have come in. I wanted to remind people that we will be posting an archived version of this webinar online on the HUD website. We'll send you all a notice when that is available and posted. And we're also going to upload all the references that you've heard mentioned today, all sorts of links and guidance materials, including that chart, which may take you a little bit longer to fully absorb. All of that material will be available on our website, and as I say, we'll email all of you to let you know when that's available. So I want to say thank you so much to our presenter, Elizabeth Rosen, for her great work today, and for Brian Gokin joining us from the National Park Service. We're very happy that you were able to join us today. Thank you very much. We'll see you again.